Welcome to the Hazelip Exchange. This is the third episode in a series on Hebrew poetry, grief, and transformation. In the first, we talked about Lament Psalms. In the second, we talked about Job. And both of those are works of Hebrew poetry. The third one we're going to talk about is Ecclesiastes. And technically, it's not so much Hebrew poetry, though it is that in many ways. It is also wisdom literature. And Job falls into the category of wisdom literature as well. Proverbs is wisdom literature. And Ecclesiastes is wisdom literature. Now, how would Ecclesiastes be a part of my own journey of transformation in grief? Well, Ecclesiastes comes to us as a teacher who raises profound questions about the nature of life and about the comforts in life and about the purpose of life and the meaning of life. In fact, the whole thing begins with, vanity, have vanities, everything is vanity, or whether you translate that meaningless or absurdity or whatever the translation you might have in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. That dominates the book. Because that word, the Hebrew word, is hebel. And that word occurs something like 37 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. Which means, in this short book, to use a word like that so many times tells us, whoa, this is at the heart of the book. And it's the motto of the book. Everything is hebel. And the word hebel is difficult to translate, because you give it one English word and you miss out on something. You miss out on a nuance. So if you call it vanity, you're missing out on the nuance of brevity. Or if you call it brevity, you're missing out on the nuance of absurdity or enigma. In other words, life just doesn't make sense. I think that's probably at the heart of it. Certainly brevity is very much a prominent idea with that word. But I think it also has a deeper meaning, a deeper theological meaning of absurdity, enigma, or as I think the NIV says, meaningless. Although I think meaningless is a little strong, because I don't think Ecclesiastes believes life is meaningless. He's just searching, or this person is searching for the meaning, searching for, okay, what's the substance of this life if we're all going to die? So the question in chapter 1, verse 3 is very explicit. What do we gain? What do we profit in living the life that we have? With all the stuff that's under the sun, with all the hebel that's under the sun, with all the junk that we live with, what do we gain? What's the profit in all this? If we're all going to die, what's the profit? And that's why he says, hebel. And we all recognize hebel. We see hebel all around us. Hebel is cancer. Hebel is war. Hebel is injustice. Hebel is death. Hebel is the chaos, the moral chaos, as well as the natural chaos that envelops our lives and ultimately swallows us up in death. And if we're all going to die like the animals die, and we're all dead like Rover all over, so what is the meaning of this? What's the purpose? Why are we here? That's an important question to process. Because hebel can give us this kind of perspective that is all worthless, that there's no point. But actually, the writer of Ecclesiastes, our teacher, says, don't be too fast with that. Yes, from where we sit, the chaos seems overwhelming. There is a trajectory in this small book that calls our attention to the goodness of creation. Even at the end, it says, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. Or in chapter 3 with that great there's a time for this and there's a time for that. There's a time to live and there's a time to die. There's a time to mourn and there's a time to dance. at the end of that poem comes a statement about the Creator, that it's all in the Creator's hands and that God has put eternity in our hearts, olam in our hearts. There's something more here than just death. Death can look like that's all there is. Death can look like that's the end of everything. Hell can overwhelm us. But our teacher reminds us that there is a good work of God going on. And 5 times we have this positive statements. The positive statements about life and the goodness of life and the value of life and the worthiness of life. So that in Ecclesiastes chapter 9, for example, the teacher says, go live life. Drink your wine, eat your bread, enjoy your spouse. Go do the work God has given you. This is a good thing. There's meaning and there's purpose in this and there's joy in this. So in some way, the writer of Ecclesiastes is telling us that there's a way to live life recognizing the Hebel, but also at the same time embracing the joy, embracing the agenda, embracing the project that God is at work at in the world. And part of that project is to give joy to us who are living out God's project in the world. So we don't have to look at the Hebel and be overwhelmed and say, this is worthless. Why even continue? No, there's goodness in the world as well. There's goodness in the creation of God. So living with the Hebel and at the same time to live in the goodness of the creation is part of the path I think we have to take for the sake of transformation. Because if we give it all over to Hebel, then we live in despair. If we give it all to the joy, then we minimize the pain and we deny the pain. And that has its own consequences. I think part of what Ecclesiastes is telling us, it's not the whole story of it, for sure, but part of what Ecclesiastes is telling us is that we need to recognize and name the Hebel. And at the same time, enjoy and recognize and embrace the goodness of this God's good created world. Can we recognize the chaos, the Hebel, and at the same time recognize the goodness of creation? That's the challenge that I think Ecclesiastes offers us. We might even take this back to the story of Genesis, because I think Ecclesiastes is using language that reminds us of Genesis 3 and Genesis 4. In fact, it's a story of that narrative of the fall, if you want to call it that. The time when humanity fell into death east of Eden. The time when Abel was killed by Cain. And Abel's a key word here, because Abel in Hebrew is the same word that Ecclesiastes uses, Hebel. Abel and Hebel. It's the same word. Interesting. Why would you name your child meaningless? Why would you name your child futility, useless? Well, maybe that's because Abel and Cain represent a kind of typology. Cain kills Abel. Abel's blood is spilled on the ground. And the lament of the ground, the cry of the ground comes up. There's a lament over what is calling upon God to do something. Cain has murdered his brother out of anger and jealousy. There is Hebel in the world. East of Eden, Hebel seemingly dominates. And at the same time, the goodness of creation continues. We marry and we bear children. We create art. We build cities. We continue the human vocation of being fruitful and multiplying, of subduing the chaos and ruling and shepherding the earth. The human vocation continues and the goodness of God continues as God enables us to domesticate animals and to live with spouses and to bear children, there's still goodness in the creation. The Habel does not overwhelm the goodness. And so I think we have to live in that tension. And that's why Ecclesiastes is such a difficult book. It's because if we don't recognize the tension, we will emphasize one over the other and have a tendency to live in one over the other. But what I think Ecclesiastes calls us to in the process of grief and in the process of suffering and in the recognition that the world is full of chaos, says, hey, name that world. It's there. It's real. Don't neglect it. Don't ignore it. Don't deny it. Habel exists. And if we want to live in a healthy way in the world, we have to name it, not minimize it, fully recognize it. At the same time, if that's the only place we live, if that is all we name, then we will live in despair. The writer of Ecclesiastes wants us to remember to name the goodness as well, to live within the goodness of creation, to drink our wine, eat our bread, enjoy our spouse, do our work, recognize what God has given in the goodness of the world that God has created. Live with both in tension. Name the Habel, enjoy the good. And that will be a path where we can experience life in a healthy balance. And I think that's the point of Ecclesiastes. That's why he concludes, remember the Creator in your days of youth. Don't forget that God has created this world and that God has meaning and purpose for this world. Yes, there is profit. There is gain. Because the gain is the relationship with God. And the gain is to recognize the joy of a good creation, even when it is saturated with chaos and hevel. And so the end of Ecclesiastes, it says, this is the main thing, right? To live with God, or to obey his commandments. Or another way of saying that is to embrace the project that God has for the world and live within God's story. God as creator, and we as human participants in God's agenda and God's mission in the world. There will be Habel, but there will also be joy. And that becomes a way of transforming grief, a way of living through grief, to not only name it, lament it, struggle with it, complain about it, but also to remember the joys of life and have gratitude for the good things in the world and the good things that God has provided through the creation.